Well, we appreciate you all coming. This is our fourth session this afternoon, and we're going to hear from Richard Hess of Denver Seminary, and his paper is entitled Context for Joshua and Genocide. All yours, Rick.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I have an apology. I actually, not being used to these sort of things, I thought that there would be a PowerPoint, and there isn't. So I have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to be using it to look at, read from, and hopefully it will not be too incommunicative in terms of what we're doing here. What I want to look at in terms of the overall perspective on this issue is I want to look first at the canonical context and at a number of Pentateuchal contexts for, or that provide a background to Joshua. And then I want to look at a kind of linguistic and archaeological approach in terms of Jericho and its status. And I'll argue that Jericho is a fort. Look at Ai and its status, and look at Joshua 10 and 11, where I think these are some of the major texts where there are issues, and then draw some conclusions. In terms of the canonical context, the very first use of Berith, of covenant, in terms of its actually being enacted, is we find after the flood. It first appears in Genesis 6, but then it occurs after the flood in Genesis 9 in particular, where you have the text in verse 6, whoso sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. This text, I think, becomes foundational. It both sets within the larger context of the flood, where I see the destruction there as having to do with the Hamas, the violence that's mentioned in Genesis 6. And that violence was of such a level and of such a degree that it would have destroyed the human race. That's how I see that as a description. So the flood, far from itself being an act of violence by God, becomes an act of salvation for Noah and his family, who otherwise would have perished within a context where people were violent, and every thought of their heart, according to the text, was violence and destructive towards one another. Coming off of that, literally off the ark, in Genesis 9 then, you get this initial statement, the first covenantal statement, which is a denial and a rejection of violence. Whoever sheds human blood, and then it says, because no amount of gold or silver or whatever can accommodate, can retribute for the death of a human being. And therefore only by human shall their blood be shed, emphasizing the extent to which, and it says, for the, of course, here's where the Tselem Elohim, the image of God, has God made mankind, comes into play. So you begin the text with a rejection of violence. Genesis 15:16 is perhaps one of the next more relevant texts, where God says to Abram, in the fourth generation, speaking of the Exodus, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. There is a sense of expectation, and there is a sense of sin and rejection of God that is involved. I'll come back to that in a bit, but it is there early on. What is interesting, however, and not always discussed in this context, is the Joseph story. And as you know the story, so I won't repeat it here, but when Joseph collects the food, we read in Genesis 47:13 and 14, there was no food, however, in the whole region, because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying. And he brought it to the Pharaoh's palace. What's important about that text is that the survival and existence of the Canaanites and of the Egyptians is owed to God's gracious provision through Joseph, according to the canonical text. That here, in this account, Canaan would have been wiped out long before the issue of genocide. They would not have existed at all. According to this, they were perishing because there was no food in the land. But God used the agency of Joseph, his interpretation of dreams and all the story behind that, And he makes that statement, again, when his brothers come to him in 50, 19 to 20. But Joseph said to his brothers, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And that's not just the lives, though it is, of Jacob and his family, but it is the lives of the Egyptians who would later seek to destroy the Israelites, and it is the lives of the Canaanites who would later do the same thing. So I think before we ever get to the issue of Joshua and genocide, you set this within the narrative context of the Pentateuch, and what you find is that they owe their very lives to the mercy of God, specifically historically, in terms of the time of Joseph. This becomes the backdrop against which their rejection of God's work becomes all the more a rejection of the lives of their ancestors and their own survival, generation after generation. Truly, the Pharaoh, but also the Canaanites, arose who did not know Joseph and forgot who he was. Now, that's sort of the narrative context. We come to the legal context, which is the familiar Deuteronomy 20, 16 to 18. "However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything it breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God." What we have here, of course, is the emphasis upon a God who is both loving and holy, and integrates these two things together in a way that we can only hope to imitate to a small extent. He creates humanity out of love. The sinfulness of humanity is taking what God has created and using it for our own purposes. In one sense, all deserve death. And in that sense, Deuteronomy 20 is justified in talking about death. This is the point of the text. It's part of a legal text that reflects an idealized structure of how the people of God ought to live. It emphasizes God's holiness and the need for complete separation from anything that would attract them into compromise. Now, that on the one hand is what should happen, what could happen, or however you want to understand that. But the question is, what actually did happen? What happened on the ground in the text of Joshua? Most people, in the terms of apologetics, do not object to God's love and goodness because of a law. They object because they perceive the Bible to describe actual destruction of innocents mandated by a cruel God. This, I think, much like those who spoke before me, especially Robert, is a matter of a case-by-case basis. It's not something that you can simply make broad, sweeping generalizations beyond what we find in the law in terms of Deuteronomy 20. But here we look at the wars of Joshua. And these wars are a description of what actually occurred, contrary to the law of Deuteronomy, which is a description of what maybe should have occurred. For Israel's understanding, then we look at Joshua 1 to 11, beginning with the story of Jericho. You notice in Deuteronomy 20 it talks about the or Arim, the cities. These cities that are described as to be destroyed and not left anything alive in them represent the military and the leadership. They represent it in late Bronze Age Canaan, oppression. And they represent the rulership of the regions. Deuteronomy 20 commands the destruction of these armies and their forts. And it represents, I think, these Arim represent an oppressive religion and ideology. I could go into this in detail about New Kingdom Egypt and the empire and the Canaanite cities, but an oppressive religion and ideology that opposed Israel as a people and opposed their God. And so, in one sense, what Joshua and Israel is doing in entering the land is to destroy this ideology of force and oppression, if you will. Deuteronomy 20, Jericho and Ai are all called cities. That's the term that's used. The word is Ir. And it really isn't a city as we think of as city, despite some speakers who want to emphasize urban mission, which I am all in favor of, but it's rather the ear as it is used throughout the biblical text has to do with the population center. It's used in Joshua 6 13 times of Jericho. It's used of the small town of Adam where the waters block up or stop so Israel can cross on dry land the Jordan River in 3:16. It's used of the village of Bethlehem in 1 Samuel 20. It's used of tent encampments in Judges 10. It's used of the citadel within the city at Rabbah, the capital of the Ammonites, in 2 Samuel 12, and the fort of Zion in 2 Samuel 5 in Jerusalem. These are all ears. So we have to have a broader understanding of what an ear is. As far as the text, it commands complete destruction of these cities. The harem comes into play here. They are to be devoted, given over to God. And it is in Deuteronomy 20 specifically the cities that are mentioned. Like Canaanite Shechem and Israelite Arad, these were walled forts. Archaeologically, they are not in late Bronze Age period and in some cases beyond that. They are not primarily where most of the inhabitants of the region lived. They are those places that contained a palace for the king, the elite, royal stores where taxes were collected and then redistributed, the temples and their priesthoods, and the barracks for the armies that were under the control of the king. The masses would have normally lived in hamlets, if you want to call them that, outside of the walls and would have come into these cities perhaps in time of warfare or threat, and certainly for customary trading and other purposes. So, when I come to Jericho and it's called an ear, how do I understand this? Well, for one thing, it was small enough for Israel to march around it 7 times in one day and then fight a battle. That's how I read Joshua 6. And Tel Es-Sultan is not a large site. It is a small site. The only non-combatants that are explicitly identified are Rahab and her family in Joshua 2. The king hears of, when he learns of Rahab and her family, or not of Rahab, but of the spies, he responds quickly. And this is consistent with the small site, that all this would happen fairly quickly in the picture that's portrayed in Joshua 2. The location of Jericho supports the idea, not only as small, but as an ear, that it was a kind of fort. It's at the end of several main roads that go into the hill country, the South Road, and the Iron Age certainly goes south to Jerusalem. Other roads go towards Beitin, and other roads go towards a bit to the north. And then you also have the north-south trade that would have gone on there. It is, in my view, very possible that the hill country sites, like Jerusalem, maybe like Bethel and others, maintained this fort as a fort and garrisoned it for that purpose and for the purpose of collecting taxes and dues and guarding the place. We see that, well, I'll get on to that. No note is given in the text of a large size to this Jericho. Unlike Gibeon, which is called an Ir Gidolah, a great city in chapter 10. Unlike Hatzor, which is said to be at the head of all the kingdoms in chapter 11. Not so Jericho. So then, if Jericho is a fort, and Rahab and her family are the only non-combatants mentioned, what about texts like 6:21, which says they devoted the city to the sword and they devoted the city to the Lord, and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. And then that's repeated with regards to Ai in 8:25, 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. Well, the Hebrew phrase, men and women, which I see as the key phrase here, is literally me'ish va'ad isha, from man unto and unto woman. It's used 7 times in the Bible, once of Jericho and once of Ai, which I've just read. It's used of Amalek in 1 Samuel 15. It's used of Nob, where Saul destroys everyone in Nob in 1 Samuel 22. and of Jerusalem when David brings everyone in 2 Samuel 6 in celebration of the Ark of the Covenant, and again in the time of Nehemiah and Ezra in Nehemiah 8:2, and it's used of all Israel, or of Israel, in 2 Chronicles 15. My point here is that all these occurrences, except the one at Nob, where children are specifically mentioned, and it's Saul's involvement there in destroying it. But all other occurrences precede or follow this statement, Me'ich v'adisha, with kol. Kol either comes before or after. It's, of course, the word for all in Hebrew. And this phrase is stereotypical, therefore, in my view, for everyone in a town or region without assuming anything more about age or gender. It doesn't require that you have to have a woman or a child or anything else, just as it doesn't require that you have to have a donkey. You had to find a donkey and bring it in Jericho and kill it. The point is, this is a way of saying everything, whatever was there, was put to death, from man to woman. And I think that's consistent. We do have other texts that say men and women, but that's not for Jericho or Ai. Jericho, the all there, in what I understand as a fort, would have been the warriors. Rahab would have been exceptional, and her family. And I think that makes sense because you have there what amounts to an inn, a place where people, merchants, and others moving through would have stayed overnight. And that's exactly where I think the spies would have gone in terms of finding information and also disseminating information, which I think they also did. The strongest objection to this whole picture, in my view, is the king, who is Melek. He's called the king of Jericho 3 times in chapters 2 and 6, and 5 times more in Joshua. The traditional meaning of Melek, then, would be a king who would be over a royal castle or fort. But the region seems to be otherwise uninhabited, so where would his subjects be? There's no other person or site mentioned in the biblical text, and there aren't sites of the late Bronze Age in this area, from Adam up north down to the Dead Sea. Well, if we look at the use of the term king in the Amarna correspondence, which is where I'm going to turn now, which is the one larger context that we actually have from this time and from this region, we find a wider use than an independent sovereign. There's some 300 letters in the Amarna corpus between Canaanite princes and Egypt's pharaohs, dating from the mid-14th century. The pharaoh is most frequently called king, Sharu in the Akkadian, and the expression "to the king my lord" is a very frequent one. In the letter from the leader of Jerusalem, Abdihape, he says in 6 of his letters, and many others from other leaders. For example, Abdi Tirshi, the leader of Hatzor, writes to the pharaoh, "to the king my lord." But then, in his letter, he describes himself as a king. He says, "This is a message from the king of Hatzor," which is him. And he's speaking to a pharaoh who is a king. So what we have here is a figure who is regarding himself as king, but not as an independent sovereign. He is subordinate to a higher level, a kind of emperor figure. It's seen in his customary self-humiliation. He talks about, "I fall at the feet of the Lord, of my Lord," that is, of the Pharaoh. The rest of the letter speaks of the coming of the Pharaoh, who is therefore a kind of king of kings. Like the leader of Hatzor was called a king and yet recognized a greater king over him, so the ruler of Jericho could have been under authority to another, whether the leader of Bethel, Jerusalem, or a coalition such as that of Joshua 10. Jericho's king, as Melek, as fort commander, would have governed troops and maintained security against enemies and their agents. And indeed, we have, in what might be an even closer parallel, in another figure from the Amarna text, and that is Piwuri, who is the commissioner of Pharaoh. He describes himself as a Malik of the king. The Malik, which sounds a lot like Melek, it's the same root. Piwuri worked all around Canaan. He was in Gaza in the south, in Jerusalem, in Byblos in the north, and his identification is glossed in one of the texts as a commissioner. So he was a commissioner, yet he was what sounds a lot in southern Canaan in the 14th century like MLK, Melek, or Malik, as it was in the Amarna text. Like Piruri, was Jericho's Melek a commissioner responsible to his overlord for military security in a region? Both would have been answerable to an overlord, whether Pharaoh or the rulers in the hill country. Now, if that's the case, and we got Jericho as a fort, then what was the size of the army? What did that look like? We don't know. We're not told, that is. No numbers indicate how large it was. We only know that there were some soldiers there because they were sent by the king to round up the spies, capture them. But how many beyond that? Again, if we look at the written evidence from late Bronze Age Canaan, what we find is in the Amarna letters, the city leaders of this region are writing to the Pharaoh in Egypt, and they are requesting reinforcements, support. The leader of Jerusalem writes, and he seeks 50 troops to defend his city. Ribadi, the leader of Byblos, seeks another, also 50. Abimilki, the leader of Tyre, seeks only 20. Now, Jerusalem is closest to Jericho, so if you have 50 additional troops as reinforcements, what was the original number? Well, I don't think it would have been in the thousands, otherwise 50 would not make much sense. But it could be a garrison maybe 3 or 4 times requested 50, maybe a couple hundred. And that seems to me much more likely at this time, given what we know of the sizes of towns and cities in this region. Thus, a city like Jerusalem had no more than a few hundred troops and possibly a smaller number. Jericho would have been fewer than the number at Jerusalem, given its size that we know and its nature as a fortress. So we're not looking at more than 100 or somewhere in that area. So then why is it, if this was conquered, why is so much attention devoted to Jericho? There are more words on Jericho in the Hebrew Bible, in Joshua, than on any other city. Why is that? Well, Jericho was, and this is where I think people naturally then assume it was some giant city. Jericho was the first battle that Joshua led. In Joshua 1, God made clear that Joshua was the leader, the successor to Moses. In 3:7, he says, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses." And this is the point. It was the first battle. It established his position as leader, as he was faithful to God and as Israel was faithful to God at that point, over Israel. And also then with the description that is given there, and we see this in the immediately following chapters, that a great fear, Rahab already confesses this in chapter 2, has fallen on the Canaanites. So that is perpetuated. That only begins to change some with Achan's sin and the initial loss of the battle at Ai. But if you actually look at the text, what you find is that in the description in chapter 6 of Joshua, of the actual battle, not of the instructions about the battle, but the actual battle, there are about 102 words in Hebrew. There are 86 words devoted to the salvation of Rahab that are interwoven, and her family, that are interwoven there. So that in terms of the relative importance, the salvation and mercy of God upon Rahab and her family was about as important as the destruction of Jericho, just in terms of the number of words. As for I see a very similar situation here. If you read the biblical text, it is an ear. I think it is a fort primarily. And you have, and it fits very well the pattern, certainly in the following centuries with the Iron Age, you have in Jerusalem, you have the forts, I think they're forts, at Gilo, at French Hill, and elsewhere scattered around the perimeter of the city to guard the passes into it. And you also have this at Ammon, at Rabbah, the Ammonite capital too. And I think that's what it was vis-a-vis something like Bethel, which was nearby. But it was a fort. And so you have the same sort of thing, similar to Jericho, with a Melek, walls, an army, and no specific non-combatants. The Melek I would then understand as a local commander with superiors. The walls would have been mud brick or a makeshift setup in some way from earlier walls. And 825, which says the He killed so many that day, so many, from man to woman, Me'ish ve'ad isha would include everyone. And if it's a fort, then it's primarily warriors and those who are defending it. And that's how I read that text, just as with Jericho. And I'm not suggesting, well, let me go on, then I'll come back to what I want to say about this whole matter. In Joshua 10 and 11, we have the description of the southern and northern coalitions. These are clearly portrayed in the text as defensive battles. In Joshua 10, the leader of Jerusalem, Adonai-Zedek, gets together all his buddies in the south, and he says, come with me and let's make war against Gibeon and teach them a lesson for making a treaty with Israel. Okay, they go up against Gibeon. Now, okay, Israel wasn't attacked, but they were in covenant treaty relation, and that's why they come down to enter into the war to defend Gibeon, and then the battle that follows. But it was a defensive battle that initiated that. If Gibeon had fallen, we could be sure that those armies would have moved on to Israel. It's clear in Joshua 11, the king of Hatzor gathers together all of his armies and chariots from the north, and their whole purpose is to wipe Israel off the map, to commit genocide against Israel. They had to fight or they faced extinction. Non-combatants are nowhere specifically mentioned. We do have the text of Joshua 10, verses 28 to 42, which is often cited, where ear or city after city is destroyed. And these, as I say, I think would be primarily understood within that context of the late Bronze Age as a fort for the king, the temple, the army, the taxes. There is no reason to assume that non-combatants were slaughtered in this context necessarily, because with the forts emptied of the armies, and you put yourself in this context, if you're an average Canaanite, around one of these cities, and your army has all gone and is being decimated by Israel, you're not going to you have a choice. You could go into the walled fort, which is devoid now of anyone to help defend it, which would be kind of suicidal, I would think. Or you could convert like Rahab did, which I don't think from Joshua 11 that many did. Or you could run away and go to some other land, which, of course, is part of the idea of dispossessing the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. But I don't think most of the Canaanites did any of that. I think what most of them did was they headed for the hills, and they hid out in the hills. And Israel would come through, they would decimate, or they would tear down the walls, making whatever city was there no longer capable of having any defense. They would destroy the temples and their images and all that sort of thing, and then they would move on. And in this way, I think that's the description of verses 28 to 42. Not only that, but the book of Judges is full of Canaanites. They're everywhere. And where do these people come from if they were all killed? I think they did exactly what the Israelites do in Judges, which is under heavy oppression, they hide out in the hills, in caves and other places. I suspect that's what they did as Israel came through. There was no extermination. So in summary, neither the biblical text of Joshua nor that of Judges supports genocide. The attacks on Jericho and Ai were assaults on military targets. The major wars that Joshua fought were defensive. The Canaanites remained in all the regions, as in Judges 1 indicates in the rest of the book, and intermarried with Israelites in the following generations. This is the narrative's understanding of these battles as I read it. The archaeological and extra-biblical textual evidence do not contradict it. In the case of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Israelites attacked forts. They did so in order to defend their own existence. And in the cases of Jericho and Ai, to challenge the claims of the kings of Canaan and their armies who claimed the land for themselves and their gods. The Israelites fought and defeated the armies of Canaan and their leaders. They did not commit genocide. As the larger context demonstrates, Joseph, the son of Israel, literally the son of Israel, rescued the Canaanites and the Egyptians and gave them life centuries before the Canaanites sought to destroy Israel. Far from genocide, the larger narrative, Genesis 9:6, which covenant includes a lot of people, the larger narrative forbade murder. And an Israelite delivered the earlier generation, that is Joseph and Israel, delivered the earlier generation of Canaan from famine and death. The descendants of Canaan repaid those to whom they owed their lives, by attempting to exterminate them. Thank you.
We got about 10 minutes for questions.
Ellen?
Thank you, Rick. Just a couple of questions. One of them is your comments on the Meish, Be'ad Haisha. And do you think that this would correspond to the hyperbolic language that is throughout the book of Joshua? That's question number one. Question number two is the fact you mentioned that there seems to be an absence of other non-combatants. That sounds to me a little bit like an argument from silence. Because the fact that they're not described, actually we have evidence that there are non-combatants just by Rahab and her family. While if we think of other cities, we don't have the non-combatants mentioned anyway. So anyway, those are my questions.
Question number one. I don't like to use the term hyperbolic because I think it connotes things that I don't want, that I'm not trying to describe here. I think certainly expressions like all Israel, or like later on in Kings, they killed all the Edomites except for who escaped and went to Egypt. But that I don't think is necessarily hyperbolic. I think that's simply a Semitic way of speaking, if you will. I'd rather use that kind of a term than impose more modern concepts on it.
So Joshua 11, would you apply that there also, where you have the description after the battle that conquered it all? Would you?
Well, again, it has to be said, and that's a different issue. It has to be set against the land that was not taken as well. So it's clear that not all the land was taken, and that's how we come into Judges. The emphasis here is on Joshua as a leader, in my view, following God's will and succeeding again and again. It's not to say he never sinned or anything else, or that they didn't, or that they took all the land. But I do think there is a kind of way of expressing it, all, every, coal, and then say, but there was this part that they didn't. So I would tend to see it more that way. And then your second question, which
the absence of, or not mention that the other non-combatants in the city, does that mean there were?
Yeah. No. And okay. I wanted to come back to this. I would not say that there was nothing along the lines of this terrible term collateral damage, but I would say that primarily these were forts. And therefore, and the fact that the Canaanites are all over the place in the next generation argues to me that this is a realistic assessment, given the biblical text, of what happened. I think it's what people did. In other words, I don't think Israel came into these forts and found lots of people there that they killed. I think they had fled, because they knew that that's exactly what Israel was doing, and they had no army to protect them. By definition, if you follow the text. Yes.
If Jericho was the fort and the people lived outside the fort, it wouldn't be logical for all the people to go into the fort during the season.
But it's different with Jericho. Jericho, I don't think there were people living outside of it. I think with Jericho you have a fort that's guarding, as I said. It's kind of it's a tax collection point. It's a little hotel there, or however you understand that, and it's guarding the passes up from there into to Jerusalem, to Bethel, I would say, and to other places that goes up. So that wasn't like a center where there's population all around it. It was different that way. It's like which too didn't have people around it. Bethel did, Jerusalem did, Shechem did, and the various cities in Joshua 10, I think, did. But not Jericho, which I see as primarily an outpost or a fort there. Yes?
Would you draw a comparison then with possibly the defensive forts in the Negev during the time of David, where you really don't have huge population centers,
Yeah.
but you've got defensive forts that are spread
Yeah,
out there?
it provides defense and probably reaps some taxation for people passing through, because that would have you would have merchants and others potentially passing through there. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I read somewhere say that Jericho city is the oldest, human populated city. So if it had been there so long, could that city be that small?
Yes. Because, well, I don't think it's the oldest, but I do think it's old. This was something that Kathleen Kenyon found. I think it was dating from the 8th millennium BC, 3 stones with holes in them, and concluded that that was a cult site there and things like that. And so it certainly is a very early site. Tel es-Sultan, the very top of the tell is everything's worn off after the 18th century, after Middle Bronze too. So you just don't have material there. And the main things you see are the tower, which is pre-pottery Neolithic, and things like this. So it's very old. But some sites disappear entirely over the centuries. Ugarit, after 1170 BC, is no longer, even though it was the chief center for trade up until that time. And I think that's the case with Jericho. Some have argued that the water in the spring went bad or something like this. I don't know. But I do think that it changed. And it never is really that large if you go to the site today, the town. And of course, later on, in New Testament, Jericho moves a couple miles away from the Old Testament site. The interesting thing about Jericho, too, that often goes is, of course, the name, Yerach. It suggests that it was a cult center for the moon or lunar deity. And that raises questions in my mind about Rahab the prostitute and whether she had any involvement in that. We don't know if it was still a cult center or if there was any kind of cultic material or anything remnant there by the time Joshua shows up. But it's just an interesting question. Yes.
What about the 12,000 people in Joshua 8:25? That's a fairly large number.
Yeah, well, that's where I read 1,000 as Eleph, which is what the Hebrew word is. And I tend to see that as a company or squad of soldiers rather than as 1,000 people. You do get this, especially in military contexts, that word for 1,000 can mean squad, and therefore it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it was, that's a translation, 12,000. It is legitimate to take Eleph with the sense of a company or squad or something like this, of considerably less than 1,000.
One more question.
On destroying the Canaanite population, what about the reason that they would subvert the Israelites' religion? How does that figure into lessening the amount of destruction?
Well, I think without question, it was God's will that everything that stood in the way of Israel and God's plan for Israel be removed, be destroyed. This is already, I think, portrayed as the Ark of the Covenant hits the Jordan River, the waters separate. No natural force is going to stand in the way of God. Jericho, which in 6:1 is described as being shut tight, and in fact the gate is mentioned twice as being closed in Jericho and Joshua too. So what happens? Israel marches around it, nakas, 7 times. It's a kind of ceremonial display, or for 7 days, and saying, is there a way in? Will these people open up? I see it as kind of bearing witness. And they don't. So what does God do? He knocks down the walls, which is exactly corresponds to this resistance. No resistance, human or natural, is going to stand in the way. So as they then come into the land, God doesn't want... Yes, I believe Deuteronomy 20. I think that they should have been... That was the purpose. Either they should be destroyed or they convert. I believe that was possible. Or they be removed from the land in some way. Because they will, and they did, lead the Israelites into worship of other gods. But I'm asking what actually happened when I read this text and when I read it in the context of late Bronze Age Canaan.
Okay, that's it. Thanks for coming.